In the strict historical record of modern warfare, national militaries are typically deployed to fight rival nations or suppress armed rebellions. Imagine, however, a modern country mobilizing combat-hardened soldiers and heavy military machine guns to face a completely different adversary. The target in this 1932 domestic combat operation was a flock of thousands of flightless birds. To understand exactly why the Australian government aimed artillery weapons at local wildlife, the timeline has to rewind to the end of the First World War in 1918. Thousands of Australian soldiers returned home from the brutal trenches of Europe. They needed employment, housing, and a way to quietly reintegrate into civilian life. The Australian government's solution was the soldier settlement schemes. The state granted these returning veterans remote parcels of land, primarily concentrated in the harsh, marginal territories of Western Australia. The men were ordered to clear the dense bushland by hand and transform it into profitable, working agricultural plots. For over a decade, the veterans carved out a meager existence in an unforgiving climate. Then, the global economy collapsed. The stock market crash of 1929 triggered the Great Depression, instantly evaporating credit lines and paralyzing international trade. For the veteran-turned-farmers of Western Australia, the financial crash escalated a difficult life into an immediate crisis of survival. In an attempt to save the economy, the government urged these men to drastically increase their wheat yields, promising financial subsidies that never materialized. Instead, between 1920 and 1929, the price of Australian wheat collapsed. The value plummeted far below the actual cost of production. Every single time a farmer planted and harvested a crop, they were actively losing money. By the early 1930s, the men in Western Australia were facing absolute starvation and the complete loss of their properties. They had survived a global war only to find themselves trapped in a losing economic battle on their own soil. In this highly pressurized environment, the farmers were backed into a corner. Any new threat to their fragile crops would guarantee an extreme, desperate response. That threat arrived on two legs. Following their natural breeding season, an estimated 20,000 emus began their annual migration. These massive native birds traditionally traveled from the arid inland regions toward the coast in search of water and food resources. As the flock moved across the continent, they stumbled upon a modern anomaly in the dry Western Australian landscape. The veterans had artificially irrigated their plots and cultivated massive, concentrated fields of wheat. To 20,000 hungry, migrating birds, these farms were a sprawling oasis. The emus stopped migrating and settled directly onto the veterans' land. The sheer physical impact of the flock was immediate. They devoured the struggling wheat crops and trampled what they didn't eat. They rapidly drained the conserved water. Their massive bodies tore gaping holes through miles of protective agricultural fencing. These breaches opened the floodgates for thousands of rabbits to pour into the fields, stripping away the root systems and sparse vegetation the emus had left behind. Facing the total erasure of their livelihoods, the farmers bypassed agricultural authorities entirely. As military veterans, they understood exactly how to handle a massive, organized threat on the field. They explicitly requested the deployment of military firepower. The ensuing mobilization represented a destructive collision where an inflexible industrial agricultural system met an unstoppable biological migration. The situation was no longer a matter of simple pest control. It was a head-on crash between human industry and the natural world. The political response was swift. The Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce, reviewed the farmers' petition and officially approved the unusual deployment of military forces. Pearce saw an opportunity to assist struggling veterans while simultaneously providing live-fire target practice for his troops. Command of the operation was handed to Major G.P.W. Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. He deployed to Western Australia with a small detachment of soldiers, armed with 2 Lewis machine guns and a staggering 10,000 rounds of ammunition. In November 1932, the military arrived on the farmland. Their tactical plan relied entirely on their experiences in the First World War. They planned to corral the birds and ambush them using the same mass fire techniques that had proven so lethal against human infantry. The soldiers moved into position near a flock of roughly 50 birds. Expecting a swift, decisive slaughter, they waited until the emus were well within range and pulled the triggers. The results defied all military logic. Instead of dropping under the hail of bullets, the vast majority of the birds simply kept running. The soldiers quickly realized a bizarre biological reality. At long distances, the emu's dense, heavy plumage absorbed the impact of the rounds. The feathers effectively acted as a layer of natural armor against long-range machine gun fire. The military's entire strategy was built on a fatal miscalculation. They had marched into the bush confidently assuming that a wild, biological entity would cluster together and fall precisely like a traditional uniform army. The emus adapted immediately. When the guns jammed or fired, the flock's natural defense mechanism activated. Instead of massing together in a panic, the birds instantly splintered into dozens of small, erratic groups, darting in every possible direction to minimize the target area. The soldiers attempted to chase them down by mounting a Lewis gun to the back of a military truck. But an adult emu can sprint at speeds up to 30 miles per hour. The birds easily outpaced the heavy vehicles, leaping over the rough Western Australian terrain while the truck violently bounced and stalled on the uneven ground. The high-speed, chaotic pursuit caused complete mechanical breakdowns. The gunners couldn't stabilize their aim, and the thick dust mixed with the violent shaking caused the Lewis machine guns to repeatedly jam. The operation's logistics collapsed entirely under the strain of chasing a target that refused to stand still. Major Meredith was astounded by his adversaries. Assessing the failure, he noted that if he had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it could face any army in the world. He explicitly compared the emus to highly mobile, invulnerable tanks. To compound the military's problems, severe weather patterns stalled the campaign. Heavy rain turned the dusty soil to thick mud, further crippling the mobility of the military trucks and exhausting the troops who were forced to trudge through the wet scrubland day after day. The full weight of the military's raw industrial firepower was neutralized. It simply could not compete with the emu's natural speed, their erratic, evasive maneuvers, and their seamless adaptation to a harsh environment that the soldiers could barely navigate. By the end of November 1932, the campaign was objectively assessed. The military had expended nearly all of their 10,000 rounds of ammunition. While historical sources vary, estimating anywhere from a few hundred to perhaps 1,000 dead birds, the total was barely a fraction of the 20,000-strong flock. Recognizing the absolute futility of the operation, the government issued a complete military recall. The immediate fallout was severe. Politicians in Parliament heavily criticized the wasted resources. Newspapers picked up the story, and it quickly became an international media circus. Journalists across the globe openly mocked the Australian military for their inability to secure victory against a flock of birds. Over the last 90 years, this event has evolved into an internet legend, generating several persistent myths. For the historical record, the Australian government never officially declared a state of war against the emus. Furthermore, despite Major Meredith's colorful analogies to the media, the military never deployed literal armored tanks against the birds. There is also the popular misconception that the Australian army was outright defeated. The reality is far less dramatic. The military was not physically beaten or overrun. They simply abandoned a deeply inefficient and illogical operation that cost too much money and yielded nearly zero results. The farmers, however, still desperately needed help. The crisis was eventually resolved through far less glamorous, practical methods. The government instituted a highly effective bounty system, paying farmers to cull the birds themselves. More importantly, they invested in massive agricultural exclusion fencing, erecting hundreds of miles of heavy wire barriers across the landscape to permanently block the natural migration routes. The events of 1932 stand as a record of profound human desperation and economic collapse. This period of history demonstrates the clear limits of violent intervention in the natural world, documenting the fallout when industrial solutions are applied to biological problems. Sometimes history isn't remembered because of the biggest battle. Sometimes it's remembered because it was simply unbelievable. What do you think? Did the Australian army really lose? Or has history turned a desperate economic tragedy into one of the world's greatest jokes? Let us know down in the comments.